So I've worked in addiction treatment for 25 years nearly, and successful addiction treatment is composed of quite a lot of different factors, different techniques. You have, of course, psychotherapy and talk therapy, counselors and therapists and psychologists doing group therapy and one-to-one therapy with addicted clients. We also these days have a lot of holistic therapies like breath work, mindfulness meditation, yoga, that sort of thing. There's the ancillary support groups like AA, NA, where perhaps Smart Recovery and other lesser known addiction support groups. Then you might, if the treatment centre is quite sophisticated, have a nuanced and structured approach to exercise and nutrition and things like that. So it's much more holistic approach than it used to be. But obviously over the years, I've met a lot of psychotherapists and seen a lot of psychotherapy happening and seen a lot of clients go through psychotherapy. And the older I get, the more I ask myself the question, does psychotherapy even work? And I recently did a video called Why Counselling Fails Men and Boys. So it should be pretty obvious from that my opinion is that it particularly seems to fail men. Now, in an addiction treatment setting, that can be a bit different because the level of immersion that somebody's having living in a therapeutic community for 1, 2 or 3 months is so intense that, of course, with a 50% effort, quite considerable amount of growth is going to occur. You can well imagine how that's very different to somebody who's seeing a therapist once a week, where, to be honest, even over a year, they'll barely get to know each other, right? And perhaps outpatient counselling, the disorders and issues that are being treated are quite likely to be not as severe as a full throttle addiction, right? So with rehabs, you have that twin factor of they're dealing with an issue that's extremely serious and life-threatening, and the immersion into the therapy is very, very intensive. So my experience of inpatient drug addiction treatment therapy is that it's at the more effective end of the counselling world, if you like. And also the techniques are somewhat different, quite a lot more confrontative, if there is such a word. Addiction therapists really have to get stuck in because they're not dealing with a nice cuddly middle-class emotional disorder or something like marital problems or mild depression. We're dealing with something that can kill you. Right? So addiction treatment is slightly different. There are so many other factors that go in, and the type of counselling that's used is quite a lot more like coaching, I would argue. So I'm talking mostly about traditional talk therapy that would happen in an outpatient setting. So I thought the best thing to do would be to look at the 6 main types of therapy as I was taught it. So the way I was taught, 6 big theorists belonging to 3 different schools or broad schools of psychotherapy. This is 20th century psychotherapy. Of course, there's been hundreds of permutations in the last 20 years. I'm not really concerned with that. I'm going to talk about the big schools of counselling and therapy that most people will have heard of. So the first is the psychodynamic school, containing Freud's therapy, psychoanalysis, and Carl Jung's therapy, usually referred to as Jungian analysis. So those are psychodynamic forms of therapy, meaning, as the word says, the idea that the mind is dynamic and has lots of different moving parts that don't necessarily work well together. So I've done several videos that were either directly or indirectly on Freud that you can check out to learn more about Freud's specific form of psychodynamic therapy. But broadly speaking, the idea that a lot of what motivates us is unconscious, not available for conscious recall. We don't know why we're doing certain things, and therapy is really an attempt to root out and make conscious things that are unconscious, and that a lot of that hidden material is repressed because of childhood events. That's largely speaking Freud's idea. So you're very interested in childhood, very assuming that problematic material will be repressed and hidden. And Jung took that in quite a different direction, really. His type of psychodynamic theory is much more explicitly spiritual. So Jung famously went on to have a lot of influence on groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, the New Age movement, things like that. To my mind, he's a much more interesting and in some ways a much more positive thinker than Freud. And I would state outright that of the two, in my opinion, Jung's therapy is much more interesting, much more accurate in terms of really understanding how humans behave. The standout unique factors of Jung's therapy, I guess, would be the idea that we should, in a way he was the therapist that first focused on the need to actualize yourself, I think, in a very positive sense. The idea that we have a spiritual dimension to our lives, and that if we don't learn to play, be creative, develop a spiritual dimension to our lives, then we'll become sick, right? And in that exact framework, he became influential on AA, who have largely speaking the same kind of instinct in their program. So that was early 20th century. By the 50s, 60s, counselling was developing along the lines of humanistic psychology, very much influenced by the 60s. So the big standout figures there are Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls, respectively. So Carl Rogers formed what was known as person-centered therapy. So he took issue with the psychodynamic thinkers and started to prove, actually quite effectively, I think, that a lot of what troubles us is a lot more conscious than Freud led us to believe, and that you can actually get people to talk about what happened in their childhood or what's bothering them. It's not particularly unconscious, and they can talk about it. The specific feature of Carl Rogers' therapy and why it was called person-centered therapy is that he did not believe in that kind of paternalistic, I'm the great guru, let me sit behind you on a couch while you tell me everything and follow my lead. He believed that the clients have the answers within themselves. So you'll also hear it sometimes called client-centered therapy. So all he had to do really was be a mirror, or to ask interesting questions and coax the person into answering their own problems. Now, that's a wonderful idea, to some extent true, and perhaps you could say more true for depending on what the emotional disorder is, right? If it's unhappiness, depression, mild anxiety and depression, things like that, just being guided to talk until you hit upon your own answers is quite helpful. And in my experience, it's really helpful in preliminary work. With addictions, for example, though, you can quite easily see how that would not work. It fails massively because the addicted person quite clearly does not have the answers within themselves, right? They have the problem is confounding them completely, okay? And so the only, arguably, to jump forward a bit, the only thing that's going to really work for an addicted person is to be healthily challenged, which is specifically really what Rogerian therapy, client-centered therapy, person-centered therapy does not do. It allows you slowly, very slowly, to come to your own answers. The other wing of humanistic 1960s flavored therapy was Gestalt therapy, founded by Fritz Perls. And the S. Allen Institute in Northern California is pretty infamous for being very counterculture flavored. Perls was quite a wacky, eccentric individual. The same kind of instinct or idea that people have something within themselves that they can that will spontaneously erupt under the right therapeutic circumstances. He was much more interested in other creative ideas, like looking at things from different angles, very playful type of therapy, asking people to locate feelings at different parts of their body. So he's in a way kind of the first movements of what would become somatic therapy, somatic psychotherapy, right? Describing emotions in terms of colours, all sorts of experimental ideas designed to try and get people to look at things from a different perspective. So almost look at things from a child's perspective. You know, when you're a kid, you think about it, you do stupid things like do a handstand and look at the ceiling and imagine that you were walking on the ceiling. That's often the way I think of Pearl's therapy, is he wanted to flip it up, change it around, get people to have a different perspective. So very experimental, very counterculture. How useful it is, I don't know. I've received some Gestalt therapy in my youth, and I found the therapist really great. How great the therapy itself was, I don't know. And after 2 years or so, to his eternal credit, he just turned around to me and said, Ali, I think you should probably go to a 12-step meeting. You can't stop drinking. So, you know, so I suspect he leaned on a lot of things other than Gestalt therapy, right? Which was precisely my original point, that you're not talking so much about what's the most effective therapy, you're talking about who's the most effective therapist. And in this day and age, I'd say that there are, to be perfectly honest with you, precious few. Thus, I need to kind of understand this more. The final major significant wing of counselling and psychotherapy development, I would say, as I was taught, was the cognitive school, or what you might call the cognitive behavioural school. What eventually became CBT, but originally was two other therapies called REBT and CT. So rational emotive behaviour therapy, developed by Albert Ellis, and cognitive therapy, developed by Aaron Beck. Again, of the two, I will state completely up front, I think Albert Ellis by far the most interesting. Again, as a person, by far the more interesting of the two. And unfortunately, it is the case that a founder or a founding theorist's personality, experiences, prejudices, bias does affect the way, obviously, that the system developed. Although now, I would say almost all of these systems are unrecognizable under the guise of thousands and thousands and thousands of individual therapists who interpret it in their own way. But both of those schools, being cognitive therapies, were, again, taking Roger's idea further, that idea that Freud's idea that everything's unconscious and unavailable is kind of not true, and that you can get people to talk eventually, if you're skillful, about what's troubling them, and that they can locate most of their so-called hidden childhood traumas. But the focus with cognitive and behavioural therapies was much more on thinking. How are you thinking in an irrational way? And Aaron Beck would literally call them thinking errors, you know, which sounds pretty harsh. Albert Ellis preferred to call them beliefs or belief systems. So of the two, again, I think Ellis's style is the most interesting and is extremely influenced by Stoicism, which we need to do a video on, because Stoicism as a philosophy has been having a renaissance for 10 or 15 years now, but it's really accelerating now. And I think this is part of the answer for a more masculine or a more male-friendly type of therapy. Okay, so Albert Ellis believed that things trigger us. He called them activators, A's, and then we think something about it. He called those B's, beliefs, and then that has a consequence, C's, and the consequences are emotional and behavioural. So the furthest that most people get is to think that an A equals a C. In other words, something activates you and you have a feeling as the consequence of that trigger. So you get on a bus, you stand there minding your own business, somebody else gets on the bus, stands on your foot deliberately, as far as you can see, and eyeballs you and then walks off and sits down. You then become incredibly angry. A equals C. an activator, a trigger happened, and you rightly got angry. But Ellis would say, no, there's a bit in between those two. There's a B, a belief. You were believing something about what happened, and that coloured the way that you felt about it. So A doesn't equal C. A plus B equals C. So now imagine you have an enlightened Buddha standing on the bus, and that same man gets on, stands on his foot and stares him out, and then goes and sits down, and the Buddha just stands there feeling perfectly forgiving and compassionate. Obviously it's a ridiculous scenario, but the point is the Buddha and you have a different belief system, and he was able to just continue feeling completely calm in that scenario, and you weren't, because you have a different belief systems. So activators and triggers do not necessarily have to result in certain emotional consequences. Depending on what your belief is, in the middle of those two things, you can change the feeling. So Ellis's theory, and to a considerable degree also Aaron Beck's cognitive therapy, drill down into belief systems and ways of thinking, or what they often call self-talk. How, and the job of the therapist, or indeed the client themselves, because you can do this on your own, which is one of the great things about CBT. It's not a guru-led type of therapy. It's a short, sensible, rational type of therapy that you can learn and take away with you. So you get an activator coming in, an A, a trigger, and you ask yourself, what am I believing about that thing? What's my self-talk? Oh, he did it deliberately. He must think I'm a pushover. I should never be a pushover. Pushovers get walked all over. And obviously a lot of these beliefs might come from childhood, and there's the link to Freud and Ellis, and well, particularly Ellis, were to some degree interested in that. Where did you develop these belief systems? Probably in childhood, what he'd call core beliefs, that then go through a review process as you get older, through teens, adolescence, adulthood. If those things keep happening to you and you keep getting the same result, you become convinced that they are true. So obviously, you, the first guy that got on the bus, not the Buddha, let's say you grew up in a rough environment, yeah, it was not profitable for you to let things like that go. And so you've developed a core belief, I must never let people get the better of me. And perhaps the Buddha didn't grow up in that environment, so he has a completely different belief system, right? The point being, eventually at some point, if you want to remove that objectionable feeling of anger, which arguably you do, if you have toxic, bent out of shape emotions, you need to do an ABC. If you feel fine, you don't need to use this technique. But if you're walking around angry, upset, sad, depressed, you can go in and analyze what you're thinking about the thing that triggered you and try and find a more rational viewpoint. So you would engage in what's called disputation. That's the D. So now it's A, B, C, D. D stands for dispute, and you're disputing the belief systems. So is it true that he did it deliberately? Did he deliberately stand on my foot? I don't know. I don't have any evidence. Maybe he's mentally ill. And you dig down and you look over and you see he's walking around the bus shouting and screaming. You go, oh, right, the guy's schizophrenic. He just got out of a psychiatric unit. Now I don't feel offended. Okay, so if you dispute things, often you can find they're not quite true. And you might have some prejudice, which is understandable. It comes from your view of the world. But if you can tweak it and change it and look at it from a different angle, then you can develop an E, an effective new action. In which case, you get off the bus, ignore the guy, maybe help him, to get off the bus or help, do something different, a paradoxical behavior, something different to what you would usually do. So this type of therapy, I found, is possibly the most useful for men in general, and certainly it's the most easy to wield in addiction treatment, because so many of the relapse triggers for addicted people are emotions and ways of thinking. It's not often going to be literally seeing a drug or a drink and getting triggered. That comes later. Usually it will be some sort of unmanageable feeling that starts the cravings and the thoughts of using, right? And so CBT is extremely useful along with things like 12 steps, to get to grips with your emotional sobriety. If you don't have, as an addict in recovery, if your emotions are not regulated, then you're going to struggle, right? So CBT has, the nearest I could get to answering the question is, what's the best type of therapy? Of course, there isn't one. It's what's the best type of therapy for this particular kind of person. And so if the average guy, blue-collar guy, ordinary bloke, geezer, who's got, he's having issues, and he said to me which type of therapy would be best, all other things being equal, if we said all of the therapists from those schools were good, I'd probably point him to CBT. But then again, if I know an absolutely excellent person-centered therapist who just is better than all the CBT therapists I know, then obviously I'd send him to them. So those were the last major schools of therapy to develop. There's been lots of permutations from those in the 21st century. You have all sorts of weird and wacky therapies now, like EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing, I think it is. I always forget exactly what it stands for. The somatic therapy, where there's not even any talking. All sorts of weird and wonderful permutations of those. But those were the main schools of therapy. So do they work? Well, I would say increasingly no. Increasingly not. Because the further we get away from I would contend that in the 60s and 70s, most therapists were relatively sensible. But now I kind of have this feeling that therapists are a bit like spiritualist mediums. Like 90% of them are like off with the fairies, and of the other 10%, 9% of them are onto something, and then 1% are geniuses. They're just channeling something, and God knows what it is, just a personal talent, some kind of foresight. There are brilliant therapists out there, there absolutely are, but I would say increasingly less, given how the field obviously has expanded. I mean, in the 1960s, 1970s, you'd hardly ever meet anybody who was a professional therapist, right? Now there must be bloody millions of them around the world, right? So obviously, I think the standards have gone down. A general rule of thumb, I think, would be usually you'd be looking at somebody who's a little bit older than you. You'd be looking, as I said, not so much for a type of therapy as a therapist that actually is good. And certainly if you have an addictive disorder, I'd say CBT, if you're going the psychotherapy route, probably has more usable tools that you can learn more quickly. But as I'll explain in another video, I don't think any form of psychotherapy comes close to lay-run support groups, mutual aid groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous when it comes to addiction. They just can't compete with the therapeutic community that a mutual aid support group, or indeed an inpatient therapeutic community, can provide. But that's a separate video, I think. So is there something that works better for men that isn't a talk therapy? And I think increasingly we're getting to the fact that the answer to that is yes. Coaching styles, I'm not talking about life coaches, whatever that even is, I don't know. I'm pointing towards perhaps the development of a counseling style that is more like coaching than counseling. So obviously the rule of thumb with counseling is that you're not an advice giver as such. You're not coaching somebody. You are in general asking useful questions, perhaps to some extent leading questions, that can lead the person to start to put things together for themselves. But I do wonder if that is really the style that works best for most men. My experience has been that most men really don't want to talk a lot about their feelings. They become quite exhausted, really, after just 10 minutes of talking about their feelings. And I've come to the conclusion, and so there's quite a lot of the scientific community, as far as I can tell, that it's just the way they're wired. Most, not all, but most. So is there something else that's therapeutic for men? Most men, again, a big generalization, but most in my experience do want to proceed fairly quickly to a solution for their problem. Their way of processing things is not to chat them through. It just isn't. The more female dominant psychotherapy has become, as I explained in that last video, why counselling fails men and boys, the more it is assumed that all humans should process their problems that way, through chatting, through long voluminous chats about one's internal states. That, in my experience, is not what works for most men. They want to frame the problem and, if possible, get a solution. Now, obviously, there are dangers in just proceeding immediately to solution sometimes. Sometimes there are issues that might need a little bit more reflection than, that's the answer, now let's fix it. But you'd be surprised. There are quite a lot of mental, emotional, behavioural health disorders for which the solution to the problem could quite easily be a swift set of actions routinely practiced, and routinely would be the important word there, right? Repetition, because if they're only practiced once, they're not going to work. And I would say, again, that's not really actually even specific to men. It can be specific to specific disorders as well, like addiction. Addiction's a brain-based behavioural disorder. Therefore, the main medicines are going to be behavioural. They're not going to be medicinal. We've already tried those. That's called crack and cocaine. Drugs of abuse are already medicinal for addicts because they have a midbrain dopaminergic illness, right? So something that you put in your mouth and swallow, or inject into your arm, is not going to solve the issue, regardless of whether it's illicit or legal, right? So we're looking for something else. But I would say that talk therapy also it quickly runs out of steam with addicted people, because it's a behavioural disorder, right? So what you're looking for is a change in behaviours that is routinely practiced. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but I would say that I think that we will soon begin to develop mental health protocols that are more designed towards men, that of course a lot of women will also find massive benefit from, that are perhaps more like what we'd call coaching in the arena of sports or management, and that are more action orientated. I mean, an obvious one would be that boxing and weightlifting for troublesome young men is a distraction therapy. It keeps them out of trouble, and what Freud actually would call a sublimation. So Freud's theory of sublimation, the idea that an energy's got to go somewhere. So he had a lot to say about that, with things like sex and artistic energy, and sex and the priesthood and things like that. If an energy is repressed, it's no good, because it's got to go somewhere, right? But the way I understand sublimation, you could put it this way. Take a young man from the inner city, could become a gang member, but goes into the boxing gym and becomes a world-class athlete. And so same kind of energy, different outcome. That's why in a lot of the inpatient rehabs that I've developed over the years, specifically when it's for youths and young men, we've focused a lot on boxing, Muay Thai boxing, jiu-jitsu, things like that, in addition to 12-step meetings that are specific to their addiction, because you've got to get addiction specific when you're looking for a support group. It's no good going to Narcotics Anonymous when you're just a nicotine addict, or vice versa, right? And healthy doses of psychotherapy that are more solution orientated. So I hope that makes it a bit clearer.